Sarah Whitmore stood in the parlor of Oakfield Plantation House, staring at her husband Thomas as if she'd never seen him before. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden light across the elegant furniture and polished floors. Everything looked normal, beautiful even. But the words Thomas had just spoken shattered that beauty like a rock through glass. "You want me to do what?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas Whitmore, master of Oakfield Plantation in South Carolina, stood before his wife with his jaw set in determination. He was 42 years old, tall and imposing, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. For 15 years he'd been a respected member of Charleston society, a plantation owner, a man of wealth and influence. And now he was asking his wife to do something unspeakable. "You heard me, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "I need an heir. A son to inherit Oakfield. You've given me 3 daughters in 10 years of marriage, but no son. The doctors say it's my condition. My seed is weak. But the Whitmore name must continue." Sarah felt her legs weaken. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Thomas, what you're suggesting is, it's adultery. It's a sin against God and against our marriage vows." "It's practical," Thomas countered. "And it's necessary. I've chosen a man, Elijah, the blacksmith. He's strong, intelligent, healthy. He'll father you a son, and that son will be raised as mine. No one need ever know the truth." Sarah stared at her husband in horror and disbelief. Elijah was an enslaved man on their plantation, 30 years old, known for his skill as a blacksmith and his quiet dignity. He was also married, bound in a slave marriage that had no legal standing but was recognized by the enslaved community, to a woman named Ruth. They had a 5-year-old daughter named Grace. "You're asking me to..." Sarah couldn't even finish the sentence. The horror of it was too much. "I'm commanding you," Thomas corrected. "As your husband. You'll do this, Sarah. You'll lie with Elijah, conceive a child, and bear me a son. This is not a request. This is an order." "I won't," Sarah said, finding her voice. "I absolutely will not. What you're asking is not only adultery, it's rape. You'd be forcing both me and Elijah into something neither of us wants. It's evil, Thomas. Pure evil." Thomas's face darkened. "You don't understand. I've already told the other plantation owners I have a son coming. I've made arrangements for Oakfield's future. If I don't produce an heir, I'll be humiliated. My business partners will question my capability to continue the family line. Everything I've built will be at risk. So you'd destroy our marriage, violate me, and force an enslaved man to father a child he can never acknowledge, all to save your pride?" Sarah's voice was rising now, anger replacing shock. "What kind of man have I married?" "A practical one," Thomas said coldly. "A man who does what's necessary to preserve his legacy. Now, you'll do as I've instructed, or you'll face consequences." "What consequences?" Sarah demanded. "What will you do, Thomas? Beat me? Divorce me?" "I'd welcome divorce over this obscenity." Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I'll have you declared insane and committed to an asylum. I have the legal right, as your husband. One word from me, and you'll spend the rest of your life in an institution. Is that what you want?" Sarah felt ice run through her veins. He was right. In 1858 South Carolina, a husband had nearly absolute power over his wife. He could have her committed to an asylum on his word alone. She'd heard stories of women who disagreed with their husbands or challenged their authority, declared hysterical or mad and locked away forever. "You're a monster," Sarah said quietly. "I'm a realist," Thomas replied. "You have until tomorrow evening to accept this arrangement. After that, I'll make other arrangements for you." He left the room, leaving Sarah sitting alone in the beautiful parlor that suddenly felt like a prison. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in her bed, in a separate bedroom she'd maintained since the birth of her third daughter, and tried to understand how her life had come to this moment. She'd married Thomas Whitmore at 19, believing she loved him. He'd been charming, wealthy, promising her a life of comfort and security. For the first few years, he'd been a decent husband. Not warm or affectionate, but not cruel either. But over time, she'd seen his true nature emerge. The casual cruelty with which he treated the enslaved people on the plantation. The way he spoke about them as property, as things to be used. The cold calculation in every decision he made. And now this, the ultimate expression of his view that people were just tools to be used for his purposes. He saw Elijah as a breeding animal. He saw Sarah as a vessel for producing an heir. Neither of them were people to him, just means to an end. Sarah knew she couldn't go through with it. But she also knew Thomas's threat wasn't empty. He could and would have her committed if she refused. Unless she ran. The thought came to her suddenly, terrifyingly. Run away. Escape. Take what little money and jewelry she could carry and flee to the north, where she might find help from abolitionists, where she might be able to build a new life. But could she really do it? Leave her 3 daughters. They were 8, 6, and 4 years old, Mary, Elizabeth, and Anne. Thomas would keep them, use them as leverage. She might never see them again. The thought of leaving her children was agony. But the thought of what Thomas was demanding was worse. And if she stayed, if she allowed herself to be used this way, what kind of example would she be setting for her daughters? That women were powerless, that they must submit to any demand, no matter how evil. No. She couldn't do that. She wouldn't. The next morning, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She went to the slave quarters alone, without her husband's knowledge, and asked to speak with Elijah. He was working in the blacksmith shop, hammering a horseshoe into shape. He stopped when he saw her, immediately setting down his tools and removing his hat, the required gesture of respect from an enslaved person to a white woman. "Mrs. Whitmore, ma'am," Elijah said, his eyes downcast. Sarah looked at him properly for the first time. She'd seen him around the plantation for years, of course, but she'd never really looked at him as a person. He was tall and powerfully built from years of physical labor, with dark skin and intelligent eyes. His hands were scarred from his work as a blacksmith. "Elijah, I need to speak with you privately," Sarah said quietly. "It's important." Elijah looked uncertain. A white woman alone with an enslaved man was dangerous for both of them, but especially for him. If anyone accused him of impropriety, he could be killed. But he nodded and led her to a corner of the shop where they couldn't be easily seen. "Elijah, my husband has told me his plan," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "His demand that you and I, that we." She couldn't say it. Elijah's face went carefully blank, but Sarah saw fear flash in his eyes. "He told me to, ma'am. Yesterday. Said I had no choice." "You don't have a choice," Sarah said bitterly. "Neither of us do. He owns you. And as my husband, he has legal power over me that's nearly as absolute. We're both his property in different ways." "I'm married, ma'am," Elijah said quietly. "To Ruth. We have a daughter, Grace. I can't, even if the master forces me, it will destroy my family." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I know. And I'm married to a man I'm now realizing is a monster. Elijah, I won't do this. I can't. But I also can't stay here. He's threatened to have me committed to an asylum if I refuse." Elijah looked at her directly for the first time, breaking the unspoken rule about eye contact between enslaved people and whites. "What are you saying, ma'am?" "I'm saying I'm going to run away," Sarah whispered. "Tonight. I'm going to take what I can carry and flee north. And Elijah, I think you should come with me." The words were out before Sarah fully realized what she was saying. But once spoken, she knew they were right. She was going to run, and she should help Elijah escape too. It was the only way to stop Thomas's evil plan. Elijah stared at her in shock. "Ma'am, you're asking me to run away with you? A white woman and a black man traveling together. We'd be caught in days. I'd be killed. You'd be." "We won't be caught if we're smart about it," Sarah interrupted. "I have money. I have jewelry I can sell. I know people in Charleston who sympathize with abolition, who might help us. And once we reach the North, we'll both be free." "Ma'am, with all respect, you don't know what you're talking about," Elijah said. "Running away isn't some adventure. It's dangerous, terrifying. Most people who try get caught. And those who get caught." He didn't finish, but Sarah knew what happened to captured runaways. Brutal punishment. Sometimes death. "I know the risks," Sarah said. "But Elijah, what's the alternative? Stay here and let Thomas use us both like animals? Watch him destroy our families for his pride? I can't do it. And I don't think you want to either." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Even if I wanted to run, and I'm not saying I do, I couldn't leave Ruth and Grace. They'd face punishment for my escape. Master Whitmore would sell them, or worse. Then we take them too," Sarah said. The plan was growing in her mind even as she spoke. "We take your wife and daughter. We all run together. That's 5 people trying to escape, including a child," Elijah pointed out. "Ma'am, that's not possible." "Neither is what Thomas is demanding," Sarah countered. "But he's demanding it anyway. Elijah, I know this is crazy. I know the odds are against us. But I'd rather die trying to escape than live under Thomas's evil." She looked at him pleadingly. "I need help. I can't do this alone. I don't know how to survive outside of plantation life. I don't know how to navigate the Underground Railroad or find sympathetic people. But you might. You've been enslaved your whole life, you know things I don't. Together, we might have a chance." Elijah studied her face, searching for something. "Why would you help us? Why would a white woman risk everything to help enslaved people escape?" "Because what's happening here is wrong," Sarah said simply. "I've known slavery was wrong for years, but I was too comfortable, too afraid to do anything about it. But Thomas's demand, it's forced me to see that I can't remain passive. I have to act. And helping you and your family escape is the right thing to do. Even if it costs you everything?" Elijah asked. "Your home, your children, possibly your life." Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I can't take my daughters. Thomas would never let them go, and trying to escape with 3 young children would be impossible. But maybe, if I make it north, I can find a way to get them back someday. That's my hope. That's what I'm holding on to." Elijah was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to talk to Ruth. This is her decision too. And Grace's future depends on it." "Talk to her," Sarah said. "But Elijah, we don't have much time. Thomas expects an answer from me by tomorrow evening. We need to leave tomorrow night, while we still can." That evening, Elijah talked to Ruth in the small cabin they shared with Grace and 2 other enslaved families. He told her everything: Thomas's demand, Sarah's plan to run, the possibility of escape. Ruth listened, her face grave. She was 28 years old, small and quick, with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. She'd been born enslaved, had never known freedom. But she'd dreamed of it for Grace. "It's dangerous," Ruth said when Elijah finished. "We could all die trying." "We could," Elijah agreed. "But Ruth, if we stay, the master will force me to do this thing. And even if I survive it, even if we all pretend it didn't happen, it will destroy us. You know it will." Ruth looked at Grace, sleeping on a pallet in the corner of the cabin. "I want her to be free. I want her to grow up knowing she owns herself. But Elijah, the risk. I know, Elijah said. Believe me, I know. But Sarah Whitmore is offering us a chance. Maybe our only chance. And I think she's genuine. I think she really will help us. Ruth thought for a long moment. Then she said, if we're going to do this, we need more help. We can't run with just the 5 of us. We need others. She was right. Escaped enslaved people sometimes succeeded when they traveled in groups, looking out for each other, sharing resources and knowledge. A white woman, a black family, and no allies would be vulnerable. Who can we trust? Elijah asked. Over the next hours, they carefully, quietly reached out to a few trusted people in the enslaved community. By midnight, they had a plan. 6 adults and 2 children would attempt escape together. Along with Sarah, Elijah, Ruth, and Grace, they'd be joined by Moses, a field hand who tried to escape once before and knew the routes, Clara, a house slave with knowledge of the master's schedules, and Daniel, a stable hand who could prepare horses. It was risky. It was probably doomed to fail. But it was their only chance. The next evening, as Thomas expected Sarah's answer, she gave it to him calmly in the parlor. I'll do as you ask, Sarah lied, her voice steady. I'll lie with Elijah. For the sake of an heir. Thomas looked satisfied. Good. You've made the right choice. I've arranged for tomorrow night. I'll bring Elijah to your room after dark. You'll do what's necessary. Yes, Thomas, Sarah said meekly. But she and Elijah and the others had different plans for tomorrow night. Plans that would shock everyone and change all their lives forever. They were going to run. The evening of the planned escape was humid and still, the kind of oppressive heat that made everything feel heavy and slow. Sarah moved through the plantation house in a daze, going through the motions of normal life while her mind raced with plans and fears. She'd packed a small bag hidden in her wardrobe, a change of clothes, her jewelry, $300 in cash she'd secretly taken from Thomas's study over the past months, and a few small items she couldn't bear to leave behind. Most precious among them were small portraits of her 3 daughters. Mary, Elizabeth, and Anne. She'd spent the afternoon with them, memorizing their faces, holding them close, knowing it might be the last time she saw them for years, possibly forever. Mama, why are you crying? 8-year-old Mary had asked. I'm just so happy to have you girls, Sarah had said, which was both true and a terrible lie. Now, as night fell, Sarah waited in her room. Thomas believed she was preparing to submit to his demands. He'd told her Elijah would be brought to her room at 10 o'clock. But at 9 o'clock, Sarah slipped out of her room and made her way to the kitchen, where Clara was waiting. Everyone's ready, Clara whispered. Moses has the route planned. Daniel has horses prepared in the woods past the south field. Ruth and Grace are waiting near the smokehouse. And Elijah? Sarah asked. He's dealing with the overseer. Making sure he's drunk enough to sleep through the night. The plan was intricate and dangerous. They'd leave in stages, so as not to draw attention. Sarah first, since a white woman walking her own property wouldn't raise questions. Then Clara, who often walked to the slave quarters at night to visit family. Then the others, one by one, meeting at a rendezvous point in the woods. Sarah made her way across the dark grounds, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She passed the stable, where Daniel gave her a barely perceptible nod. She passed the overseer's house, where she could hear Jackson's drunken snoring. Then she was in the woods, away from the house, and she allowed herself to breathe. One by one, the others joined her. Clara arrived first, moving silently through the trees. Then Moses, then Ruth with Grace bundled in a blanket, trying to keep the child quiet. Daniel came last, leading 3 horses he'd quietly taken from the stable. But Elijah was missing. They waited, every minute feeling like an hour. Sarah kept looking back toward the plantation, terrified they'd see torches, hear dogs, know they'd been discovered. Finally, Elijah appeared, running through the trees. "We have to go. Now." Jackson woke up early. "He'll realize I'm gone within minutes." "Everyone mount up," Moses said urgently. "Sarah and Clara on one horse, Ruth and Grace on another, the rest of us on foot. We move fast and quiet." They began to run through the woods, following paths Moses knew from his previous escape attempt. The horses picked their way carefully through the darkness, while those on foot ran as quietly as they could. Behind them, back at the plantation, a bell started to ring. Jackson had discovered the missing people. The alarm had been raised. "They'll send the dogs," Elijah said grimly. "And the patrollers. We need to reach the river, water will hide our scent." They ran faster, branches tearing at their clothes, the darkness making every step treacherous. Grace began to cry, frightened by the frantic movement. Ruth tried to soothe her while maintaining their pace. Sarah had never run like this in her life. Her fine dress caught on bushes, her shoes, designed for parlors, not wilderness, quickly became soaked and uncomfortable. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept moving. Behind them, she could hear dogs barking, men shouting. The chase had begun. They reached the river after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. It was a wide, dark expanse of water, moving fast enough to be dangerous. "We go in," Moses said. "Follow the river downstream for a mile, then come out on the other side. The dogs can't track us through water." "I can't swim," Sarah admitted, suddenly realizing how unprepared she was for this escape. "Hold on to the horse," Elijah said. "They can swim. Just hold on and let them pull you." They plunged into the water, cold despite the warm night, moving fast enough to be frightening. Sarah clung to the horse's mane, letting the animal pull her downstream. Around her, she could hear the others splashing, Grace crying, Ruth trying to comfort her daughter while keeping her above water. The current was stronger than Sarah expected. It pulled at her dress, threatened to drag her under. Her hands ached from gripping the horse's mane. But she held on, because the alternative was drowning or capture, and both were unthinkable. After what felt like an eternity, Moses signaled them to climb out on the far bank. They emerged soaking wet, shivering despite the warm night, exhausted. "They'll expect us to go north," Moses said. "So we go west first, toward the mountains. We hide during the day, travel at night. I know a place, a cave about 10 miles from here. We can rest there." They walked through the night, leaving the dogs and patrollers behind. By dawn, they'd reached Moses's cave, a small opening in a rocky hillside, well hidden by brush. They collapsed inside, too exhausted to speak. Sarah looked at her companions, these people she barely knew, who she'd thrown her lot in with, who were now her only family and support. Ruth was holding Grace, whispering reassurances to the frightened child. Clara was checking everyone for injuries. Daniel was keeping watch at the cave entrance. Moses was studying a rough map he'd drawn from memory. And Elijah sat against the cave wall, his head in his hands, processing everything that had just happened. "We did it," Sarah said quietly. "We actually escaped." "We escaped the plantation," Elijah corrected. "But ma'am, Sarah, we're not free yet. We're fugitives now. Runaway slaves and a white woman helping them escape. If we're caught, Ruth, Grace, Clara, Moses, Daniel and I will be killed. You'll be sent to an asylum or worse. We have hundreds of miles to go before we're safe." "How far to the north?" Sarah asked. "Pennsylvania border is about 500 miles, Moses said. Maybe 6 weeks of travel if we're lucky, longer if we have to hide or go around populated areas." 6 weeks. Sarah tried to comprehend it, 6 weeks of running, hiding, constant danger. 6 weeks away from her daughters, not knowing if she'd ever see them again. But she'd made her choice. There was no going back now. Over the next days, they developed a routine. Sleep during the day in whatever shelter they could find, caves, abandoned cabins, dense forest. Travel at night, guided by the North Star, following routes Moses remembered and paths other runaways had taken. They stole food from fields and gardens. They avoided all contact with people, knowing anyone they encountered might turn them in for reward money. They moved constantly, knowing slave catchers and patrollers were searching for them. And slowly, painfully, they began to trust each other. Sarah learned about Elijah's life, how he'd been born enslaved, had taught himself to read using a Bible he'd found, had married Ruth in a ceremony that had no legal standing but was real to them. How he'd dreamed of freedom but never thought he'd try to run, because the risk to his family was too great. She learned about Ruth's strength and courage, about how she'd survived things Sarah couldn't imagine, yet maintained hope and dignity. About Grace, who at 5 years old was learning to be silent and careful, to hide when strangers approached, to trust her parents absolutely. She learned about Moses's previous escape attempt, how he'd made it almost to Virginia before being caught, how the beating he'd received had left permanent scars. About Clara, who'd been separated from her children when they were sold, and who saw this escape as her chance to maybe, someday, find them again. About Daniel, young and idealistic, who believed freedom was worth any risk. And they learned about her, about the life of privilege she'd led, the gradual awakening to the evil of slavery, the terrible demand her husband had made that forced her to finally act. "You gave up everything," Ruth said one night as they huddled in an abandoned barn. "Your home, your children, your entire life. For us." "Not for you," Sarah corrected gently. "For what's right." Thomas's demand made me see that I couldn't keep living in that system, benefiting from slavery while pretending it wasn't my responsibility. I had to do something. "Still," Ruth said, "most white women wouldn't have. They'd have submitted to their husbands' demands and justified it somehow." "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged. "But I couldn't. And once I decided to run, helping all of you escape felt necessary. Natural, even. We're all trapped by the same evil system, you more than me, obviously, but trapped nonetheless. It made sense to escape together." 2 weeks into their journey, they had their first real crisis. They'd been spotted by a farmer while stealing food from his garden. He'd fired a shotgun at them, missing, thankfully, but had raised the alarm. Within hours, a hunting party was after them, tracking them through the woods. They ran all night and through the next day, too frightened to stop. Grace, exhausted and frightened, finally gave out. Ruth carried her, but it slowed them down. "They're gaining on us," Daniel reported from his position at the rear. "I can hear the dogs." "There's a river ahead," Moses said. "Big one, too wide to follow like we did before. We'll have to cross it." But when they reached the river, they found it was swollen from recent rains, moving fast and dangerous. "We can't cross this with Grace," Ruth said, looking at the churning water. "She'll drown." "We have no choice," Elijah said grimly. "The hunters are minutes behind us." They were trapped, raging river ahead, hunting party behind. Sarah looked at the others, saw the fear and desperation in their faces, and made a decision. "I'll stay behind," she said suddenly. "I'll let them catch me. I'm white, they won't kill me. They'll take me back to Thomas, probably to an asylum. But while they're dealing with me, you all can cross the river. You can get away." "No," Elijah said immediately. "We don't leave people behind." "You have to," Sarah insisted. "Grace can't make it across that river if we're all trying to rush. But if you have time, if there's no one chasing you, Ruth can help her across safely. Someone has to buy you that time." She looked at them all. "This was my choice from the beginning. Let me see it through." "There's another way," Moses said suddenly. "Sarah, give me your jewelry. All of it. And all the money you're carrying." Sarah didn't understand, but she handed over the jewelry, a necklace, 2 rings, a brooch, and the money they had left, about $100. Moses took it and ran, not away from the hunting party, but toward them, angling through the woods in a different direction from where the rest of them were hiding. "What's he doing?" Sarah asked. "He's being bait," Elijah said grimly. "Drawing them away from us." They heard Moses crashing through the woods, deliberately making noise, leading the hunters away from the river. The barking of the dogs changed direction, following the new trail. "Move," Elijah said urgently. "We cross now while Moses has them distracted." "But he'll be caught," Sarah protested. "He knows," Ruth said quietly. "He's choosing to sacrifice himself so the rest of us can make it. We honor that sacrifice by surviving." They plunged into the river. The current was strong, the water deep. Sarah went under once, came up choking, kept moving. Ruth had Grace on her back, the child clinging desperately while her mother fought the current. Clara slipped on the rocks and was swept downstream. Daniel dove after her, managed to grab her, pulled her to the far bank. By the time they all made it across, they were exhausted, battered, missing Moses, and aware that his sacrifice had bought them maybe an hour at most. But they'd crossed the river. They were still free. And they had to keep moving. That night, huddled in a grove of trees, wet and miserable and grieving Moses's capture, they made a pact. "We all make it or none of us does," Elijah said. "No more sacrifices. No more leaving people behind. We're a family now, all of us. And families stick together." They all agreed, even knowing it was probably an impossible promise to keep. But it gave them strength to keep going. And over the next 4 weeks, as they made their painful way north, they held to that promise. When Clara twisted her ankle and couldn't walk, they carried her. When food ran out, they all went hungry together. When patrollers got close, they hid together, silent and terrified, until the danger passed. And slowly, mile by painful mile, they got closer to freedom. They'd been on the run for 5 weeks when they reached Virginia, only a few days' journey from the Pennsylvania border and freedom. They were exhausted, filthy, hungry, and desperate. But they were also close, so close they could almost taste freedom. That's when Jacob Mitchell entered their story. They encountered him at dawn, as they were looking for a place to hide during the day. He was a white man, about 40 years old, working alone in a field near the road they were carefully skirting. The group froze when they saw him, ready to run. But he saw them too and held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm a friend. I work with the railroad. The Underground Railroad, the network of abolitionists who helped enslaved people escape to freedom." Sarah had heard of it but never imagined she'd need its help. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Elijah asked, keeping himself between Jacob and Ruth and Grace. "You don't," Jacob admitted. "But I can tell you've been traveling for weeks. You're exhausted, you're hungry, and you're close enough to freedom to almost make it. But almost doesn't count. You need food, rest, and safe passage for the last stretch. I can provide that." He looked at Sarah. "And ma'am, with respect, a white woman traveling with fugitive slaves is going to draw attention. You need papers, a story, something to explain your presence if you're stopped." He was right about everything. They were barely hanging on, surviving through desperation and luck. Professional help could make the difference between making it to freedom and being caught. "I have a farm about 2 miles from here," Jacob continued. "A house with a hidden cellar where you can rest safely. Food. Clean clothes. And I can forge papers that say you're all legally freed, traveling to Pennsylvania with your employer, that would be you, ma'am. It's not perfect, but it's better than what you have now. Why would you help us?" Ruth asked, her voice suspicious. "What do you get out of it?" "The satisfaction of knowing I did right," Jacob said. "I believe slavery is an abomination. I help when I can. That's all." They debated in whispers, weighing the risks. Trust him and possibly walk into a trap. Or keep going on their own and probably fail from exhaustion. Finally, Sarah made the decision. We'll come. But if this is a trap, know that we won't go quietly. Fair enough, Jacob said. His farm was small but well maintained, with a barn and a modest house. He led them to the barn first, had them wait while he checked to make sure no one was around. Then he brought them into the house and showed them the hidden cellar, a room beneath the kitchen, accessed by a trapdoor under a rug. It was dark and cramped, but it was safe. And Jacob brought them food, real food, hot and plentiful, the first proper meal they'd had in weeks. Rest today, Jacob said. Tonight, I'll have the papers ready, and you can continue north. 2 days to the Pennsylvania border, maybe 3. You're almost there. They ate, and for the first time in weeks, they let themselves relax slightly. Sarah watched Grace actually smile as she ate fresh bread with butter. She saw Ruth and Elijah hold each other, allowing themselves to hope. Do you think we're really going to make it? Clara whispered to Sarah. I think we have a real chance now, Sarah replied. But something was nagging at her. A feeling she couldn't quite name. Jacob seemed genuine, his story made sense, everything about the situation felt right. So why did she feel uneasy? That afternoon, while the others slept, Sarah quietly made her way upstairs. She told herself she was just stretching her legs, getting some air. But really, she was looking for something to either confirm or dispel her uneasiness. She found it in Jacob's study, a letter, half-written on his desk. She knew she shouldn't read it, that it was a violation of privacy. But something made her pick it up. To the sheriff of Greenfield County, it began. I am writing to report the presence of 7 fugitive slaves on my property, along with 1 white woman assisting in their escape. I am holding them until you arrive. Sarah felt the world drop out from under her. Jacob wasn't a friend. He was a slave catcher, one who posed as an Underground Railroad conductor to trap fugitives, then turn them in for the substantial reward money. Her first instinct was to run downstairs, warn the others, flee immediately. But she forced herself to think. Jacob was in the barn doing chores, she'd seen him from the window. If they ran now, he'd see them and could easily raise an alarm. They needed to be smart about this. Sarah went back downstairs quietly. In the cellar, she woke Elijah with a gentle hand on his shoulder, then motioned for silence. She gestured for him to follow her up, and showed him the letter. Elijah's face hardened as he read. He's already sent word, he whispered. Look at the date, he wrote this hours ago. There's probably a sheriff and slave catchers on their way here right now. We have to leave, Sarah said. Now. Before they arrive. They woke the others and explained quickly, quietly. The group moved through shock and fear to action within minutes. But as they prepared to leave through a back window, they heard voices outside. The sheriff had arrived early. They were trapped, lawmen at the front of the house, Jacob in the barn. The only way out was through the cellar itself, which had a small window that opened to the outside at ground level. Too small for adults, Daniel observed, looking at the window. But Grace could fit through. We send Grace out, Elijah said quickly. Ruth, you tell her to run to the woods and hide. Stay hidden until after dark, then make her way north. She's small, she's smart, she might make it. No, Ruth said, her voice breaking. I won't send my baby out there alone. It's the only way, Sarah said gently. If the sheriff takes us, Grace will be sent back to slavery at Oakfield. But if she gets away now, she has a chance. They could hear Jacob talking to the sheriff above them, voices growing louder as they entered the house. Please, Ruth, Elijah begged. Let her try. Ruth looked at her daughter, 5 years old, terrified, clinging to her mother. Then she knelt and spoke quietly to Grace. Baby, you need to be brave now. Braver than you've ever been. You're going to climb out that window and run to the woods. Hide there until dark. Then walk north, following the North Star Papa taught you. Walk until you find kind people who will help you. Mama, I'm scared, Grace whispered. I know, baby. But you can do this. You're strong and smart. And someday, we'll find you again. I promise. She kissed Grace's forehead, then lifted her to the window. Daniel helped push her through the small opening. They watched as Grace dropped to the ground outside, looked back once with terrified eyes, then ran for the woods. Above them, they heard Jacob, there in the cellar, Sheriff. Under the kitchen. The trapdoor opened. The sheriff looked down at them, a satisfied smile on his face. Well, well. 7 fugitive slaves and a white woman aiding and abetting. That's quite a catch. They were pulled out of the cellar and lined up in Jacob's kitchen. The sheriff had brought 3 deputies and 2 professional slave catchers, men who made their living hunting down runaways. Which plantation are you from? The sheriff asked Elijah. Oakfield, Elijah said quietly. In South Carolina. Charles Whitmore is the master. And you? The sheriff asked Sarah. What's a white woman doing running with slaves? Sarah lifted her chin. My name is Sarah Whitmore. Charles Whitmore is my husband. I'm helping these people escape because slavery is evil and my husband is a monster. I'd do it again. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. You're Whitmore's wife. There's been a search out for you. Your husband's been half mad with worry, or more accurately, with rage. Said you ran off with his property. He smirked. He's going to be very interested to get you back. And to get his slaves back too. There's a substantial reward. He turned to Jacob. Mitchell, you've done good work. The reward for these 7 is $1,500. You'll get your usual finder's fee. Thank you, Sheriff, Jacob said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. They were shackled, the formerly enslaved people in heavy chains, Sarah in lighter restraints since she was white. They were loaded into a wagon for the journey back to South Carolina. As they rode away, Sarah looked back at Jacob's farm, hoping desperately that Grace had made it to the woods, that the child was hidden and safe. She'll die out there, Ruth said quietly, tears streaming down her face. She's 5 years old and alone in the wilderness. She'll die. No, Elijah said firmly. Grace is strong. She's smart. She'll survive. She has to. He said it with certainty, but Sarah heard the doubt underneath. The terror of a father who'd just sent his only child out into a dangerous world alone. The journey back to South Carolina took 2 weeks. They were kept in chains the entire time, given minimal food and water, treated like animals by the slave catchers. The sheriff, at least, made sure Sarah wasn't physically harmed. She was white, after all, and there would be questions if a white woman was mistreated. But psychological harm? That was acceptable. The sheriff made sure Sarah knew exactly what awaited her: commitment to an asylum for the insane, loss of all rights, probably never seeing her daughters again. Your husband's within his legal rights to have you locked away, the sheriff told her. You helped slaves escape. You abandoned your children. You've proven yourself unfit as a wife and mother. No judge will question his decision. Sarah knew he was right. In 1858 South Carolina, a woman had virtually no rights against her husband. Thomas could do whatever he wanted with her, and society would support him. But even knowing that, she didn't regret her choice. She'd done what was right. And 5 people, Elijah, Ruth, Clara, Daniel, and hopefully Grace, had tasted freedom, even if briefly. That meant something. When they finally reached Oakfield Plantation, Charles Whitmore was waiting. He looked older than when Sarah had left 5 weeks ago. Haggard, angry, but also strangely triumphant. He'd gotten his property back, his wife, his slaves, his control. Sarah, he said coldly. Welcome home. This isn't my home anymore, Sarah replied. This is a house of evil, and you're a monster. I'll never submit to you again. Thomas smiled, a cold, cruel expression. We'll see about that. Sheriff, I want these slaves locked in the punishment cells. They'll face appropriate discipline for their escape attempt. As for my wife, I have arrangements to make. The sheriff handed Sarah over to Thomas, along with legal papers confirming her return. Thomas's hands on her arm felt like shackles. You thought you could run from me, Thomas said quietly, his voice venomous. You thought you could help my property escape and suffer no consequences. You were wrong, Sarah. So very wrong. And now you'll pay for your defiance. Sarah was taken to her room and locked in. Guards were posted outside. She was a prisoner in what had once been her home. But even imprisoned, even facing commitment to an asylum, even knowing she might never see her daughters again, Sarah felt something unexpected, pride. She'd stood up to evil. She'd fought back. She'd helped people escape slavery, even if temporarily. And somewhere out there, a 5-year-old girl named Grace was hopefully making her way to freedom, carrying with her the hope of a better world. That night, locked in her room, Sarah heard screaming from the slave quarters. Thomas was punishing the runaways, making an example of them. She covered her ears but couldn't block out the sounds. This is the world we've built, she thought. This cruelty, this evil, all so some people can be rich and comfortable. And we justify it with lies about race and civilization and necessity. She thought about her daughters, asleep somewhere in this house. They were growing up in this system, being taught that it was normal, acceptable, right. Would they become like Thomas? Would they perpetuate this evil? Or would they, somehow, learn what Sarah had learned, that some things are worth sacrificing everything for, that evil must be fought even when the costs are high, that freedom and dignity matter more than comfort and security? She didn't know. But she hoped. She prayed. And she waited for whatever came next, knowing that even if she lost everything, she'd done what was right. And sometimes, that had to be enough. Sarah remained locked in her room for 3 days. Food was brought by a house slave she didn't recognize, a young woman who wouldn't meet her eyes and didn't speak. Sarah tried to ask about the others, about Elijah and Ruth and Clara and Daniel, but the woman just shook her head and left quickly. On the 4th day, Thomas came to her room with 2 men Sarah didn't know. Sarah, these gentlemen are doctors from the Charleston Asylum for the Insane, Thomas said formally. They're here to evaluate you and determine if commitment is necessary. The doctors were cold and professional. They asked Sarah questions clearly designed to prove her insanity. Did she understand that helping slaves escape was wrong? Did she recognize that she'd abandoned her children? Did she feel remorse for her actions? To every question, Sarah answered honestly, no, helping people escape slavery was right. Yes, leaving her children was agonizing, but staying would have meant submitting to evil. No, she felt no remorse for trying to help people be free. The doctors exchanged glances and made notes. After an hour, they delivered their verdict to Thomas. Mrs. Whitmore shows clear signs of moral insanity, the lead doctor pronounced. She has inverted values, believing wrong to be right and right to be wrong. She shows no maternal feeling, no wifely duty, no proper understanding of her social position. We recommend immediate commitment. No. Sarah said, panic finally breaking through her calm exterior. I'm not insane. I'm perfectly rational. I simply disagree with slavery. That's not insanity, that's conscience. Delusions of moral superiority are a common symptom, the doctor said dismissively. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll be taken to the asylum this afternoon. Treatment will begin immediately. Thomas, please, Sarah begged, hating herself for begging but desperate. Don't do this. Think of our daughters. Think of what this will teach them, that their mother was locked away for believing slavery is wrong. Is that the lesson you want them to learn? The lesson I want them to learn, Thomas said coldly, is that defiance has consequences. That challenging the natural order leads to ruin. That women who forget their place end up exactly where you're going. He turned to the doctors. Take her. And make sure the treatment is thorough. As Sarah was being led from the room, the house slave who'd been bringing her food appeared in the hallway. This time, the woman looked directly at Sarah and whispered 2 words, "They escaped." Sarah's heart leaped. Who? Who escaped? But the woman was gone, and the doctors were pulling Sarah down the stairs, out of the house she'd lived in for 10 years, toward a carriage that would take her to the asylum. As the carriage pulled away, Sarah looked back at Oakfield Plantation one last time. She saw her 3 daughters watching from an upstairs window, their faces pressed against the glass. She saw the slave quarters, where people she tried to help were being punished for daring to want freedom. She saw Thomas standing on the porch, triumphant and terrible. And she saw, for just a moment, a figure in the shadows near the tree line, a man who looked like Elijah, watching the carriage leave. The Charleston Asylum for the Insane was a nightmare of a place. Women, almost all of them perfectly sane, were locked in small rooms, subjected to treatments that were actually torture. Cold water baths. Isolation. Physical restraints. Medications that left them drowsy and confused. Sarah was put in a room with 3 other women. One had been committed by her husband for hysteria. She'd dared to question his spending of her family money. Another had been committed by her son for melancholia. She'd been grieving her husband's death for more than a year and the son wanted to remarry her quickly to a wealthy friend. The third woman had actually attempted suicide and probably did need help, but the asylum's treatment was making her worse, not better. "They'll keep us here until we either die or break," the first woman told Sarah. "Until we agree to whatever our families want, until we become docile and obedient. That's the real purpose of places like this, not to heal, but to control." Sarah quickly learned the asylum's rules: obey without question, never argue with the doctors, show proper feminine submission. Any defiance resulted in punishment, isolation, restraints, forced medications. She endured it for 2 weeks, playing the role of the broken, repentant wife. She told the doctors what they wanted to hear, that she now understood slavery was necessary, that she'd been temporarily insane to help the runaways, that she wanted nothing more than to return to her husband and children and resume her proper place. It was all lies, but they were the lies needed to survive. On the 15th day, something remarkable happened. A lawyer appeared at the asylum, demanding to speak with Sarah Whitmore. The doctors tried to refuse, but the lawyer had a court order. His name was Harrison Blake, and he was from Boston. He sat across from Sarah in a small visiting room and studied her carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been hired to represent you," he said. "By someone who believes you're being unjustly imprisoned." "Who?" Sarah asked. "I'm not at liberty to say. But this person has provided evidence that you're perfectly sane, that your commitment is motivated by your husband's desire to punish you for moral opposition to slavery. I've filed a writ of habeas corpus demanding your release." "That won't work," Sarah said bitterly. "My husband has legal authority over me. No judge will go against him." "Perhaps," Blake acknowledged. "But Mrs. Whitmore, something's happened that changes the situation. 6 days ago, 4 people showed up in Boston, 3 formerly enslaved adults and 1 5-year-old child. They were brought there by a network of Underground Railroad conductors. The child is named Grace." She told quite a story about a group that tried to escape from Oakfield Plantation, about a white woman who helped them, about being separated from her parents but making it to freedom alone. Sarah felt tears stream down her face. "Grace made it. She survived. She did. And her story has become news throughout the northern states. Abolitionist newspapers are running articles about the brave child who walked alone to freedom, about the white woman who sacrificed everything to help enslaved people escape. You're becoming famous, Mrs. Whitmore. Or infamous, depending on one's perspective. What about the others? Sarah asked urgently. Elijah, Ruth, Clara, Daniel. Blake's face grew serious. I don't have good news there. After you were captured, they were returned to Oakfield and severely punished. But Mrs. Whitmore, 10 days ago, something extraordinary happened. Another escape attempt was made, but this time, it was successful. 23 people escaped from Oakfield Plantation in one night, including the 4 who tried before. They had help, from abolitionists, from other enslaved people, from people who'd been inspired by your story. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. They're free. 14 of them have made it to the north so far. The others are still in transit, but reports suggest they're safe. And Mrs. Whitmore, the mastermind of this escape, was someone unexpected. He pulled out a newspaper and showed her an article. The headline read, "Oakfield Overseer Helps Slaves Escape, Says Former Mistress's Courage Inspired Him." Sarah read in shock. Jackson, the overseer who'd been helping hunt them during the first escape, had helped orchestrate the second one. The article quoted him. I watched Mrs. Sarah Whitmore risk everything to help people she barely knew. I watched her choose conscience over comfort. And I realized I'd been participating in evil. I couldn't do it anymore. So I helped them escape, all of them, and I left with them. I'd rather be a poor free man in the North than a rich accomplice to slavery in the South. Your actions started something, Mrs. Whitmore, Blake said. You showed people that slavery could be resisted, that the impossible was possible. And now Oakfield Plantation is in chaos. Your husband has lost most of his enslaved workforce. His reputation is destroyed. And there's increasing pressure on authorities to investigate how a white woman ended up in an asylum for the crime of opposing slavery. Over the next weeks, Blake fought for Sarah's release. He brought in expert doctors who testified she was completely sane. He presented evidence of Thomas's abuse of power. He made the case a cause célèbre in northern newspapers. Finally, a judge ruled that while Thomas had the right to commit his wife, the evidence suggested Sarah was not insane and that her commitment was punitive rather than therapeutic. She was released into Blake's custody and immediately taken north, out of Thomas's reach. Sarah arrived in Boston to find she'd become a controversial figure. Abolitionists celebrated her as a hero. Defenders of slavery condemned her as a traitor to her race and class. Everyone had an opinion about the white woman who'd sacrificed her comfortable life to help enslaved people escape. But Sarah didn't care about public opinion. She cared about finding the people she tried to help. Blake took her to a safe house where many of the Oakfield refugees were staying. And there, in a simple room in a Boston boarding house, Sarah was reunited with Elijah, Ruth, Clara, Daniel, and Grace. The little girl who'd been separated from her parents for 6 weeks, who'd walked alone through the wilderness to freedom, ran to Sarah and threw her arms around her. Miss Sarah! Grace cried. You came back. Mama said you would. Sarah held the child and wept. Then she embraced Ruth and Elijah, and Clara, and Daniel, and all the others who'd made it to freedom. You did it, Sarah said. You're actually free. Because you showed us how, Elijah said. Because you were willing to risk everything. We figured if a white woman who had everything to lose was willing to fight, we could fight too. Over the following months, the Oakfield refugees built new lives in Boston. Elijah found work as a blacksmith. Ruth took in sewing. Clara was eventually reunited with one of her children, who'd also escaped north. Daniel became an activist, speaking at abolitionist meetings about his experiences. And Sarah became a voice for abolition. She wrote her story, published as Narrative of Sarah Whitmore, A Southern Woman's Awakening to the Evil of Slavery. It became one of the most widely read abolitionist texts, second only to Uncle Tom's Cabin. She never saw her 3 daughters again. Thomas made sure of that, poisoning them against their mother, telling them Sarah had abandoned them and gone mad. But Sarah held on to hope that someday, when they were grown, they might seek her out and learn the truth. 3 years after her escape, in 1861, the Civil War began. Sarah worked tirelessly for the Union cause, helping freedmen and refugees, nursing wounded soldiers, advocating for emancipation. And in 1863, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Sarah stood with Elijah, Ruth, Grace, Clara, Daniel, and dozens of other formerly enslaved people and celebrated. Not just because slavery in rebel states was now officially ended, but because their courage, the courage to run, to fight, to refuse submission to evil, had been part of the movement that made this moment possible. On that day, Ruth said to Sarah, "You gave up everything for us. Your home, your children, your entire life. Why?" Sarah thought about Thomas's terrible demand, about the moment she'd realized she couldn't participate in the system anymore, about the choice to run that had seemed insane but necessary. "Because some things are worth sacrificing everything for," Sarah said simply. Freedom. Dignity. The belief that all people are equal and deserving of respect. "I had to choose between comfort and conscience. I chose conscience." "And you don't regret it?" Ruth asked. Sarah thought about her 3 daughters, now teenagers, still in South Carolina with their father. She thought about the comfortable life she'd given up, the security and status. She thought about everything she'd lost. "I regret not being able to know my daughters," she said honestly. "That's a grief I carry every day. But do I regret the choice itself? No. Because slavery is evil, and I couldn't participate in it anymore. Whatever the cost, it was worth paying." She looked at Grace, now 8 years old, learning to read and write in a free school. She looked at Elijah and Ruth, building a life together without the threat of being separated and sold. She looked at all the people who'd found freedom, in part because she'd been willing to risk everything. "That's worth any price," Sarah said. 20 years later, in 1878, Sarah received a letter. It was from her oldest daughter Mary, now 30 years old. "Dear Mother," it began. "I've spent 20 years believing you were mad, that you abandoned us out of selfishness or insanity. But I'm a grown woman now with children of my own, and I've begun to question the stories Father told us. I've read your book. I've researched what really happened. And I've realized something: you weren't mad. You were brave. You chose conscience over comfort, and I'm only now beginning to understand what that must have cost you. I'd like to meet you, if you're willing. I'd like to know my mother, the real woman, not the caricature Father created. And I'd like you to meet your grandchildren. Please write back. Mary." Sarah wept as she read the letter. Then she wrote back immediately, beginning a reconciliation that would eventually include all 3 of her daughters. They came to visit her in Boston, Mary, Elizabeth, and Anne, now adults with their own lives and perspectives. They met Ruth, Elijah, Grace, now a young woman working as a teacher, and all the others. They heard the real story of what had happened, why their mother had made the choice she did. "I don't know if I could have done what you did," Mary admitted. "Leaving your children, risking everything. I hope you never have to face such a choice," Sarah said. "But if you do, if you're ever confronted with evil and asked to participate in it, I hope you'll have the courage to refuse. Even when it costs you everything." Sarah Whitmore died in 1895, at the age of 77. She was surrounded by her daughters and grandchildren, by Ruth and Elijah and Grace, now with children of her own, and by dozens of people whose lives she'd touched through her courage and conviction. At her funeral, Grace, now 52 years old and a prominent educator, gave the eulogy. "Sarah Whitmore was asked to participate in evil," Grace said. "Her husband demanded she lie with an enslaved man to produce an heir, treating both of them as animals, as tools for his use. She could have submitted. Many women in her position would have, out of fear or conditioning or belief they had no choice. But Sarah refused. And that refusal changed everything, not just for her, but for all of us. She showed us that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing right anyway. She showed us that one person, standing up to evil, can inspire others to stand up too. She showed us that comfort and security mean nothing if you have to compromise your soul to keep them. Grace looked at Sarah's daughters, at the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at all the people whose lives were different because of one woman's choice. The master's wife was shocked when he asked her to lie with a slave, Grace concluded. But what she did shocked everyone more. She refused. She ran. She fought. And she changed the world. Let's honor her memory by carrying forward her courage, by standing up to evil, by choosing conscience over comfort, by believing that one person really can make a difference. Thank you, Sarah Whitmore. For your courage. For your sacrifice. For showing us what it means to truly live free. And in that moment, in that room full of people whose lives had been transformed by one woman's impossible choice, Sarah Whitmore's legacy was secure. She'd started with nothing but a terrible demand and a desperate choice to run. She'd ended with freedom for dozens, inspiration for thousands, and proof that even in the darkest systems, individual courage could shine light and create change. The master had made his shocking demand. But his wife's response, her refusal, her escape, her transformation from complicit beneficiary to active resistor, had shocked everyone more. And that shock had rippled outward, inspiring others, creating change, proving that slavery could be resisted and that courage mattered. That was her legacy. And it would endure long after she was gone.